The cheapest house on Oak Ridge Lane sold in cash on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, the whole street already had opinions. It was a wreck, peeling paint, a collapsed gutter, a front yard that hadn't been touched in years. The man who bought it showed up with a truck, a few boxes, and no furniture to speak of. Neighbors watched from their driveways as he carried his things inside, not once glancing at the crumbling walls around him. He wasn't fixing the outside. He wasn't even looking at it. The only things he touched were buried deep within details no one else had noticed in years. When the street finally learned why no one said a word. Nobody on Oak Ridge Lane bought a house without a plan. Every home on that street had been maintained, updated, and inspected, with the kind of obsessive care that came from having too much time and just enough money to care what the neighbors thought. Lawns were edged on schedule. Gutters were replaced before they sagged. Even the color of a front door went through quiet, unspoken approval from the rest of the block before a single coat of paint was applied. That was the culture of Oak Ridge Lane, and it had held for decades without much resistance. Then Noah Bennett moved in, and the culture flinched. He was somewhere past 40 with the kind of face that had been weathered, not by age exactly, but by something heavier. He worked with his hands restoration mostly, old furniture, old fixtures, things other people had written off. He had a reputation in certain circles for being good at bringing things back from the edge. His truck was a faded navy. His tools were worn, but organized, and he spoke only when spoken to, which in his first week on Oak Ridge Lane meant he said almost nothing at all. He paid for the house in cash, closed quietly, and moved in on a Tuesday, with less than most people brought to a studio apartment. The house had been vacant for years. Before that, it had passed through a string of short-term owners who never quite committed to it, each one leaving it slightly worse than they found it. The roof had patches over patches. The front porch tilted faintly to one side. Paint had peeled so long ago that the bare wood beneath had started to gray and split. By the time Noah's offer came in, the seller was relieved just to be done with it. The price reflected every year of neglect, and the neighbors on either side had quietly accepted that the house was simply the one eyesore the block had to live with. What they didn't expect was for the new owner to agree with them and do nothing about it. The first weekend after Noah moved in, two neighbors from across the street watched from behind their curtains as he hauled in equipment. Not construction equipment, not anything you'd use to repair a gutter or repaint a wall. He brought in sanders and small clamps, bottles of solvent, and strips of veneer, the kind of tools you'd use on a restored cabinet or an antique door frame. He went straight past the collapsed porch railing without touching it. He walked by the cracked window on the ground floor like it wasn't there. Whatever he was working on, it wasn't the outside, and it wasn't anything the street could see. By the end of the first week, the theories had started. Margaret Hale, who lived 3 houses down and organized the block's quarterly potluck, told her husband over dinner that the man clearly didn't have the money to do a proper renovation. She said it without cruelty, the way people deliver a verdict they've already made peace with. Her husband nodded and didn't argue. Across the street, Dennis Park decided Noah was the kind of person who didn't understand what it meant to live in a neighborhood like this one. Someone who had stumbled into a purchase without thinking through the social contract that came with it. A few others said nothing out loud but started keeping track. How long had the porch been like that? When was the last time someone raked that yard? What exactly was going on inside that house? Claire Donovan, who lived directly next door, was the only one who didn't speculate. She watched like the others, but she watched differently, with the quiet attention of someone waiting for a detail that hadn't appeared yet, rather than a verdict that had already been written. She had introduced herself to Noah on his second day, brought over a plate of food she'd made, and walked away knowing only his name, and that he thanked her in a way that sounded like he meant it. That was more than most people gave her to work with, so she held on to it. 2 weeks and Richard Coleman came to the front door. Richard was the head of the Oak Ridge Lane Homeowners Association, a position he had held for 6 years, and treated with the seriousness of someone who believed neighborhood standards were the only thing standing between civilization and collapse. He was dressed neatly, carried a clipboard, and stood on Noah's tilting porch with the practiced patience of a man who had done this before and expected results. Noah opened the door, looked at the clipboard, and waited. Richard explained in measured and polite language that the property was currently in violation of several community appearance standards. The exterior had not been addressed since purchase. The porch was a safety concern. The yard had not been maintained to the standard the neighborhood required. He listed them all not unkindly, but with the precision of someone who had already written up the formal notice waiting in his folder. He told Noah that the association had given previous owners grace periods, and that the same grace would be extended 30 days to bring the exterior into compliance, or the association would begin the formal process. Noah listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't show any particular reaction to the clipboard or the list of violations. When Richard finished, Noah looked at him for a moment and said that he understood. Then he asked if there was anything else. Richard, who had prepared for pushback and found none, said that was all for now, and that he hoped they could resolve this without further steps. He left the way he came, clipboard tucked under his arm, feeling neither satisfied nor entirely sure of what had just happened. Inside, Noah went back to what he'd been doing before the knock. He was working on the interior door frames, the original ones installed sometime in the early 1960s, with a particular profile that had been covered over by at least 2 generations of amateur renovation. He was stripping them back carefully with tools that required patience rather than force. The wood underneath was intact. It had survived everything that had been layered on top of it, which was more than he could say for most things. That night, the lights in the house were on until past midnight. The neighbors who noticed said nothing about it, but they noticed. And Richard Coleman, sitting at his desk to draft the formal notice he would send, if 30 days came and nothing changed, had the quiet, settled feeling of a man whose authority had been acknowledged, though he couldn't have explained why that acknowledgement left him vaguely uneasy. The 30 days began, and Noah kept working not on anything the street could see, but on something that clearly mattered to him more than the street's opinion ever would. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday, printed on HOA letterhead, with Richard Coleman's signature at the bottom. Noah read it, once set it on the kitchen counter next to his coffee, and went back to work. The notice outlined the violations in numbered order, referenced 3 separate sections of the community code, and included a schedule of fines that would begin accruing after the 30-day window closed. It was thorough. Richard had done his job well, and Noah didn't dispute that. He just didn't change what he was doing. By the 3rd week, the rumors had taken on a structure of their own. Margaret Hale told the potluck group that she'd heard from someone who'd spoken to someone else that the man had lost a job, possibly more than one, and that the house was less of a choice and more of a last resort. Dennis Park posted a carefully worded note in the neighborhood's online forum asking whether anyone else had concerns about the property's impact on surrounding home values. The post got 14 responses, most of them agreeing, a few asking for patience, and one from Claire Donovan that said simply that she'd spoken to the man and that she thought people were getting ahead of themselves. Nobody asked Claire what she meant. They weren't looking for a counter-argument. They had already decided what kind of story this was. Noah heard the talk the way you hear distant traffic present, consistent, not particularly relevant to what you're doing. He kept his hours long and his interactions short. When he picked up supplies from the hardware store 2 towns over, he paid in cash and drove home without stopping. When Claire knocked on his door one evening with a question about a shared fence post that needed replacing, he answered honestly, offered to fix it himself at no cost, and didn't invite her in. She stood at the threshold long enough to catch a glimpse of the interior, the walls half stripped, the floors bare, the original window casings exposed and sanded smooth, and said nothing about any of it until she was back in her own house, sitting at her kitchen table, with a distinct feeling that she was missing something important. The fine started on the 31st day. Richard sent a second letter, this one with a dollar amount at the top. Noah paid it. He transferred the funds from his account within 48 hours and sent a brief reply acknowledging receipt and noting that he was aware of the timeline. Richard, who had expected either conflict or compliance, received instead a kind of quiet, deliberate acknowledgement that gave him nothing to push against. He mentioned to his wife that evening that the situation was unusual. She asked what he planned to do. He said he wasn't sure yet. It was Walter Marsh who changed everything. Walter was 81 years old and had lived on Oak Ridge Lane longer than anyone else on the block. He had moved in during the late 1950s, raised a family, outlived his wife, and stayed not out of stubbornness exactly, but because the street was the only place where he still recognized everything. He had watched every house on the block change hands at least twice over the decades. He knew the history of each one, the way other people knew their own families. And the house Noah had bought, that particular house, Walter knew better than any of them. He came by on a Saturday morning unannounced and knocked with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had no intention of being turned away. Noah opened the door, took in the older man's face, and stepped aside to let him in without being asked. Walter walked slowly through the front room, looking at the walls, the floors, the door frames Noah had been working on. He didn't say anything for a long time. He ran one hand along the edge of the restored casing near the hallway, the profile that Noah had spent 2 weeks uncovering, and his expression shifted in a way that wasn't grief exactly, but was close to it. "I knew the people who lived here before it went to ruin," Walter said. He wasn't looking at Noah when he said it. He was looking at the doorframe. Noah kept his voice even. "I know. I was one of them." Walter turned then. He studied Noah's face with the careful attention of someone working backward through decades of change, matching what he saw now against something stored much further back. Then he nodded once slowly, in the way people do, when a thing they suspected turns out to be true. Noah had lived in that house for 3 years in his early 30s. He and his wife Rachel had rented it when it was still in decent shape before the roof started going, before the succession of owners who didn't care. They had lived in it, the way young people live in places they love, without knowing they'll have to leave completely carelessly, without documenting anything, because there seemed to be no reason to. Rachel had picked the kitchen tiles. She had pressed her hand against the original molding in the hallway and said she'd never seen a house that still had it. She had meant to come back to this street for the rest of her life. She hadn't made it past 42. Noah told Walter this in the front room, standing near the window he'd been careful not to replace. He didn't dress it up. He said Rachel had died 4 years ago, and that he had spent 2 of those years trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with the rest of his time. He said the house had come onto the market by accident. He hadn't been looking for it, and that when he saw the listing, he recognized the window shape from a photograph he'd kept in a box in his closet. He said he didn't buy it because it was cheap. He said he bought it because it was the only place left that still held the shape of something he couldn't rebuild from memory alone. He wasn't looking for pity when he said it. He was just saying what was true. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting. When Noah was done, Walter looked around the room again at the bare walls, the careful work, the deliberate attention to every original detail, and said that he understood. He also said gently but directly that the rest of the street didn't know any of this. Noah said he was aware of that. Walter asked if he intended to tell them. Noah said he wasn't sure it was their business. Walter said that might be true, but that it was getting harder for the street to give him the benefit of a doubt. They hadn't been given any reason to extend. 3 days later at a meeting, Richard Coleman had called to discuss the ongoing violation and the question of next steps. Walter Marsh showed up and told them. He didn't make it dramatic. He stood at the front of Richard's living room with 12 neighbors seated around him and explained what he knew in the same plain, unhurried way he did most things. He said Noah had lived in that house before any of them had thought about it. He said Noah's wife was buried in a cemetery 40 minutes north of Oak Ridge Lane. He said the work Noah was doing inside wasn't negligence or poverty or disregard. It was the opposite of all three. It was the most deliberate thing any of them had probably ever seen a person do for someone who was already gone. The room was quiet when he finished. Richard Coleman sat with his clipboard in his lap and didn't write anything on it. Margaret Hale looked at the table. Claire Donovan, who had come to the meeting already doubtful of the framing, felt the specific relief of someone whose instinct had been confirmed, but who took no pleasure in it. The story had shifted. Not from bad to good, not in any clean or comfortable way, but from something the street thought it understood, to something it clearly didn't. The question was no longer what was wrong with the man in the rundown house. The question was what they had all been doing while he grieved in silence, and they drafted letters about curb appeal. That question landed differently for different people. For some, it softened into sympathy and the desire to help. For others, a few the ones who had built their identity around what the block looked like from the outside, it calcified into something harder. Dennis Park said privately to his wife that he felt for the man he genuinely did, but that grief wasn't a code exemption. Margaret Hale stopped repeating the rumors, but didn't retract them either. And Noah, who hadn't been at the meeting, who hadn't asked Walter to say anything, and hadn't known he was going to sat in the house that night, with the reality that the street now knew his story, and that knowing it hadn't made anything easier. The door frames were finished. The window casings were stripped and sanded and ready for the next stage. The kitchen was still in rough shape. The porch railing was still down. There was more work ahead than behind, and the money he'd set aside for it was thinning faster than he'd planned, and the fine schedule from the HOA hadn't stopped because Walter Marsh had told a room full of neighbors something true. He looked at the hallway casing the one Rachel had touched and stayed there for a while without moving. The house still wasn't done. He was still alone. And the street now knew everything except what it was going to do about it. The week after Walter's speech, Noah got a call from the bank. It wasn't unexpected. He had known the number for a while, had been watching it the way you watch a storm moving in from a distance, close enough to track, but still far enough to believe it might turn. It didn't turn. The restoration work had taken longer than his estimates, the materials had cost more, and the fines from the HOA had been pulling steadily from the same account he'd been drawing on to finish the house. The man on the phone was professional and not unkind, but the math was the math. If Noah couldn't demonstrate forward progress on the property and stabilize his finances within 60 days, his position became untenable. The word the man used was untenable. Noah wrote it down on the back of the HOA envelope and looked at it for a while after the call ended. He went through the numbers that night at the kitchen table, the same table he'd brought with him from his last apartment, the only piece of furniture in the house that wasn't original to it. The interior work was close. The door frames were done. The window casings were finished. The kitchen tiles Rachel had chosen were still intact, beneath 2 layers of linoleum he'd peeled back himself over the course of a single long weekend. The floors needed work. The porch still needed to be made structurally sound. And the exterior, the thing the HOA had been citing from the beginning, hadn't been touched at all. He could finish the inside, the part that mattered to him, and still lose the house before the outside was ever addressed. He sat with that for a long time. The hallway was visible from where he sat, and the casing near the doorway caught the kitchen light, the way it must have caught it decades ago before anyone had thought to cover it. He had done that. He had given it back its original shape. But a house that gets sold to cover a debt doesn't keep its shape for long. The next owner would paint over it, sand it down, replace it entirely with something modern and smooth and without memory. He knew that with the certainty of someone who had done restoration work long enough to understand what happened to things when people stopped caring about what they were. The question the outline of his life kept returning to was the same one it had always been: how much was enough? He had spent 4 years asking it in different forms. How much grief was enough before you were allowed to move forward? How much of Rachel could he carry before the weight of it stopped being love and started being something else? He hadn't answered it yet. He wasn't sure this house was the answer either, but it was the closest thing to one he'd found. And losing it felt less like a financial setback and more like a second ending he hadn't been prepared for. Claire Donovan knocked on his door on a Tuesday evening, which had become something close to a habit over the past few weeks. Not intrusive, not demanding, just present in the way that some people are present when they've decided you matter to them and they haven't asked your permission about it. Noah opened the door. She was holding a folder, which was different from the usual evenings, and she said she wanted to show him something. Before he made any decisions, he couldn't walk back. She had talked to people. Not in the way the neighborhood usually talked, not gathering opinions, not building consensus, but specifically, deliberately to the people on the block she thought might actually do something useful. Walter Marsh had already told her he would help with the porch. He was 81, so help meant supervision and instruction rather than labor, but his knowledge of how the original structure was built was more valuable than another set of hands anyway. A man named Greg Faulkner, who lived 4 houses down and had done framing work before he retired, said he'd give 2 weekends if someone covered the materials. Claire herself had priced out the exterior paint, the closest match to the original color she could find from old photographs Walter had kept, and the number was manageable if it wasn't coming from Noah's account alone. Noah looked at the folder. He didn't say anything right away. Claire had laid it out without drama, without the performance of charity, and he recognized the effort it had taken to do it that way, to make help look like logistics rather than pity. He had not asked for any of it. He had not suggested it was needed. She had just decided, and she had done the work, and now she was standing at his door with a folder that represented a version of the next 60 days that didn't end with a bank decision. He told her he appreciated it. He told her he wasn't sure he was comfortable with it. She said that was fine, and that he didn't have to be comfortable with it for it to be the right call, and that she wasn't asking him to feel good about accepting help. She was asking him to let the porch get fixed before winter made it worse. He looked at the folder again, then he stepped aside and let her in. Work on the exterior began the following Saturday. Greg Faulkner showed up at 8 in the morning with tools and a truck, and Walter Marsh came an hour later and stood near the porch with the specific authority of someone who had watched that structure go up and knew every decision that had been made in its construction. Noah worked beside them quieter than either of them, doing the parts that required the most precision and saying little beyond what the work demanded. Claire brought coffee and stayed not hovering, but present, and by midday, the porch railing had been rebuilt from scratch, using the same profile as the original something Walter had insisted on, and Greg had executed, without complaint. Margaret Hale walked by at some point in the afternoon and stopped on the sidewalk long enough to watch. She didn't offer help, but she also didn't leave quickly. She stood there with her arms crossed, studying the porch, and then she said that the railing looked like it belonged there. Noah looked up from what he was doing and thanked her. She nodded once and walked on. It wasn't much. It was more than nothing. Dennis Park drove past twice and didn't stop. That was its own kind of statement, and everyone present understood it the same way without having to say so. The exterior work took 3 weekends in total. Noah handled the paint himself, working early in the mornings, before the street was active, applying it in thin coats, the way the original siding needed to be done, if you wanted it to last. The color was close, not identical, because nothing was ever identical after that much time, but close enough that Walter said it looked the way he remembered it, and that was the closest measure of accuracy available. The roof still needed attention that would require a contractor and a budget Noah would have to build toward. But the porch was solid, the paint was done, the yard had been cleared, and the exterior, for the first time since Noah had moved in, met the standards the HOA had been citing from the beginning. Richard Coleman drove by the week after the paint dried. He slowed at the house and looked at it from the road without stopping, and then he kept driving. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Not a fine notice, not a formal citation, but a brief acknowledgement that the property had been brought into compliance and that the association considered the matter resolved. It was signed by Richard in the same neat hand as all his other letters. Noah read it and set it on the counter next to his coffee in the same spot where the first notice had landed months before. Inside the house was finished, not renovated, not in the way the neighbors would have renovated it, with new cabinets and recessed lighting and the kind of updates that added resale value and erased everything that had come before. It was restored. Every original detail that could be saved had been saved. The door frames carried the same profile they'd had in the early 1960s. The window casings were stripped to bare wood and refinished. The kitchen tiles Rachel had chosen were clean and sealed and visible again after years under other people's choices. The floors were refinished in the original tone, not the dark stain that had been fashionable at some point in between. The house looked like itself, like the version of itself that existed before neglect had covered it over, and walking through it felt like walking through something that had been remembered rather than invented. Noah stood in the hallway on the last night looking at the casing Rachel had touched. He had thought about her every day for 4 years, and in this house he had thought about her differently. Not as an absence, not as the shape of something missing, but as someone whose presence had actually been here in this specific place and whose sense of what was worth keeping had turned out to be right. She had seen something in the original molding that 2 generations of owners after her had decided to bury. Noah had decided she was right about it. That felt like enough. He wasn't healed. That wasn't the word for it, and he didn't reach for it. He was still a man who had lost something he hadn't recovered from, and probably wouldn't not completely. But the house was done, and it was still his, and it looked the way it looked in the photograph he'd kept in a box in his closet, the one that had first shown him the window shape he'd recognized in the listing. He had matched it. He had given it back. The street had gone quiet about him in a way that was different from the beginning. At the start, the quiet was the quiet of people who had decided what they thought and didn't need to say it out loud. Now it was something else, more uncertain, more attentive, like people who had been handed a question they hadn't finished answering. What was a house worth? What was a neighborhood for? What did it mean to look at where someone lived and think you understood anything at all about who they were or what they carried? Noah didn't pretend to have answered any of it for them. He had just done what he came to do, and the house that had been the worst property on the block, the one the street had been quietly embarrassed by, the one that had generated formal notices and neighborhood forum posts, and a room full of people ready to make a decision, was now by any honest measure the most carefully considered home on Oak Ridge Lane. Not the most valuable, not the most updated, but the most considered, the most intentional, the most true to what it had originally been. Walter Marsh walked by one morning not long after and looked at the porch, solid and square, the railing rebuilt exactly as it had been, and said nothing. He just raised one hand slightly, as he passed the way people do when words would only reduce what they're trying to say. Noah, working near the front window, saw it. He raised his hand in return. That was all. It was enough.